mystery is unfolding at this Sacramento address. And that story tops News 10 tonight at 6.
Detectives discovered a body buried at a downtown Sacramento home. Police fear they may find more.
In November 1988, detectives uncovered the remains of 7 people buried in the backyard of a boarding house in Sacramento, California.
I'm sitting in this hole, and I'm hanging on to what looks like a human femur bone.
The unlikely killer was the 59-year-old landlady of the property, and her face would become recognized as one of the most evil and unexpected serial killers of all time.
Her whole personality was really her greatest weapon because it didn't arouse any suspicion whatsoever.
She's already one step ahead of law enforcement, not only because she's managed to escape, but simply because of her physical appearance and her demeanor.
But looks, it seems, can be deceiving. This is the story of Dorothea Puente. On the 10th of December 1993, 64-year-old Dorothea Puente was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder of 3 elderly residents of her boarding house in Sacramento, California.
Where we're standing right now is where I would first encounter the first set of remains.
Dorothea Puente did not have the face of a typical serial killer.
I think when we think about serial killers, first and foremost, we typically picture men, right? And that's statistically accurate. Most serial killers are men, not women. Also, she was slightly older in age, and she had a very unassuming look.
There's a very definitive image there of a grandmotherly figure. She has short, white permed hair. She has large rimmed glasses. She is dressed quite demurely. She looks very soft in the face. If we looked at that image, not knowing anything about her, as a society generally, we would automatically say, older lady, harmless, innocent, and that's exactly what Dorothea played on.
Here was a 59-year-old woman at the time of her arrest who was known in the neighborhood for sharing vegetables from her garden with the neighbors, taking in low-income tenants, feeding stray cats, and yet she was capable of horrific crimes. She committed murder.
Dorothea Puente ran a boarding house for mentally ill and developmentally disabled residents, so it seemed like she was very concerned about helping the underserved in her community. She rubbed shoulders with the upper echelon of society. She seemed to be philanthropic and altruistic, so she was extremely adept at hiding herself in society where nobody would ever question her motives.
Following the 1993 trial and incarceration of Dorothea Puente, it would be a long 15 years without anyone seeing or hearing from the Death House Landlady, until Sacramento-based journalist Martin Coos wrote to the then 79-year-old Puente in jail requesting an interview.
I was a senior editor for Sacktown magazine from 2007 until 2010. About the summer of 2008, one of the editors suggested writing a letter to Dorothea Puente behind bars. She had maintained more or less a public silence since her trial, which was in 1993. So I sent it off, never expecting to hear anything back from her. You sort of feel like you're addressing a letter to the heart of darkness. This is a person who has committed horrible crimes, represents the worst of humanity. And at the same time, I think there is deep curiosity about why people commit such acts, what motivates them. And so there is a kind of fascination as a journalist to try to understand people's motivations.
During his research into the case, Coos was immediately drawn to the crime scene and the horror that police discovered at 1426 F Street in downtown Sacramento on the 11th of November 1988.
This case initially began on November 7th, 1988. I received a report, and it was a missing persons report. What I started doing then was running a background check on the missing person, who was Bert Montoya, and trying to get a little bit of background on him, and also running a check on the caretaker who was in charge of this particular individual. And Bert was a disabled adult, and the caretaker, Dorothea Puente, was apparently in charge of him living here.
Detective Cabrera discovered that Puente was on parole after serving 3 years in prison for fraud. His interest piqued. He decided to pay her a visit.
November 11th, I met with Judy Moise, a social worker, and Jim, the parole officer, and then it was Terry Brown, my partner, and myself. My intent was that I wanted to search the premises to see if Bert was here. Prior to leaving on that day, Judy Moise turned to me and said, "You guys better take some shovels." And I went, "Well, what for?" And she said, "Because I've driven by in the past and I've seen mounds of dirt out there. And it kind of looked like a burial ground."
A one-time friend of Puente had raised suspicions about her to detectives in the past, but this was the first time the police would visit her property. Detective Cabrera decided to take Judy Moise's advice, and they arrived at 1426 F Street with shovels. Puente invited them in.
I walked in, the house was very neat, very nice. I was looking for all the different signals that someone under a lot of pressure might exhibit. Perspiration, jitteriness, multiple eye blinking, things like that. Absolutely nothing.
When the police first arrived to Dorothea Puente's apartment, she was relatively cool, calm, and collected. I suspect because, number one, she likely has a very high threshold for anxiety. And I suspect that she was already thinking one step ahead.
The next thing I did was I asked her if I could search her room up here just to be able to tell the social worker that we searched her room and Bert wasn't here. And she agreed that. She said, "Yeah, whatever." And so I went in and I started my whole search of the premises.
When Detective Cabrera's search of Puente's apartment was complete, he had found nothing untoward.
Then I said, "I have one more question for you. Can I dig in your yard?" She says, "Yeah, sure. Go ahead." And she gave us permission to dig in her yard. 3 of us were digging, and in one of the holes is what we started finding something similar to cloth. And it just seemed out of place in the ground. There were so many pieces of it, it started to look like it was a shirt, or it could have been a dress of some sort or something like that. And so I piled it up, and the further down I would dig, I'd keep finding more pieces. And I was down to about 3 feet. And that's when I thought I struck a tree root. I took the shovel and I started banging on it, and I started trying to dislodge this root or sever it so I could continue to dig down. And I couldn't do it. It just wouldn't break. So I got down in the hole, and with both of my hands and bracing my feet, I just kept pulling on this, what I thought to be a root. And I pulled on it and pulled on it, and finally it dislodged itself. And I'm sitting in this hole, and I'm hanging on to what looks like a human femur bone. And at that time, get out of the hole, and I realized something's up. We've just come across human remains.
In 2008, 15 years after she was incarcerated for the murders of 3 vulnerable people under her care, journalist Martin Coos wrote to 79-year-old serial killer Dorothea Puente in prison. He did not expect a reply.
A few weeks went by, 3 or 4 weeks, and I received an envelope stamped with the Central California Women's Facility State Prison. Much to my surprise, the letter, which was written in almost like a grade schooler's cursive, said that she was willing to have me visit her at the prison. I had come to understand a little bit more about her and what had shaped her motivations, but to then be holding that letter seemed nothing short of extraordinary because she had maintained this public silence for the last 20 years. I filled out the visitor's form, arranged a date on which to drive down to Chowchilla, where Dorothea was imprisoned, and set off. This was October of 2008. So just almost a full 20 years since her arrest.
Dorothea Puente was born in 1929, and she had an extremely tumultuous childhood. There is a lot of evidence that she was emotionally abused, that she had no parental stability. At the age of 9, her mother lost custody of her, and Dorothea Puente ended up in an orphanage. As a way of coping with this, she started to kind of tell these fantastical stories. Children, engaging in fantasy and even telling some lies is not out of the ordinary. But with Dorothea, it was a little bit different. I suspect that she engaged in these lies to try and self-preserve and to try and paint a different picture of her life, not just for herself, but for the outside world.
She was married by the time she was 16, before which she was already engaging in prostitution. Her survival instincts will have taken over in many of those situations as she got older as well.
When we think of caretakers or people in the helping profession, in the medical field, we typically picture people who are high in empathy, care about others, want to contribute to society. So it's interesting to think that Dorothea Puente picked this line of work. However, I suspect that her motives were very different than the motives of a typical healthcare worker. She viewed sick people as potential victims.
It was back in 1982 that carer and landlady Dorothea Puente first appeared on the criminal register.
Dorothea had been in prison from 1982 to 1985. During that time, she had pled guilty to fraud. She was forging signature on the back of Social Security checks of her victims and then cashing them. Well, she pled guilty to that and also pled guilty to putting stupefying drugs in her victims' drinks. She pled and received a prison sentence in 1982. Well, in 1985, she was paroled. And when she paroled, she came back to Sacramento, and she came back to 1426 F Street.
There were many missed opportunities throughout her criminal career where she should have been flagged much earlier than she really was. And in fact, she was actually categorized as a high-risk parole case. But she was clearly not closely monitored because part of her parole conditions were that she shouldn't be involved in anyone's care and particularly shouldn't be involved with the elderly. And yet she was doing both by running an unregistered illegal boarding house.
I I think the reason she was able to convince law enforcement and society at large that she was a rehabilitated individual is because this is a woman who is extremely adept at pathologically lying. And so it's not a shock that she was able to convince the world that she'd learned her lesson, that she'd been rehabilitated, that she can be trusted again.
In 2008, local journalist Martin Coos had been granted a visit with inmate Dorothea Puente, who was 15 years into her life sentence for murder. It would be the first time she'd spoken to a journalist since her incarceration in 1993.
During that drive, about 2 hours, there were two primary thoughts. One was simply, what are her reasons for wanting to talk? And two, will she really show up? Will she indeed have a conversation with a reporter?
Coos arrived at the prison and was escorted to the visitors' hall.
I waited, and I waited, and I waited some more. I scanned the room, wondering if perhaps I had missed her, but knowing that I hadn't. And that's when the door clanked open once more, and in walked Dorothea.
After 15 years in prison, Puente no longer resembled the woman whose face had become so familiar to Martin Coos.
She had aged visibly. She walked with a little bit of almost like a limp. She had snow white hair pulled back with a pink scrunchie. She had oversized glasses that gave her the appearance of an owl. And then she made her way toward me. And that moment was striking. This was the first time I had ever interviewed a serial killer. And that's a moment that isn't analogous to any other, because this is someone who has repeatedly taken the lives of others. So I stood up to greet her. We shook hands. Her hand felt small, bony. She gave me a tight smile, and we began. She had a scratchy voice, but very strong. She was coherent. She, at different times, was a bit cheerful, but much of the time, there was a sense of deep self-pity. She felt sorry for herself. I said very explicitly to her that we were coming up on the 20th anniversary of her arrest, and that I was interested in talking to her about the case and to see if she was interested in further explaining her perspective on what had happened. Before I got very far into that preamble, she interrupted me, and for the first time, she looked me square in the eye and said, "I'm not guilty."
It was back in 1988 that Detective John Cabrera, whilst investigating a missing persons case, had discovered what seemed to be human remains in the garden of 59-year-old landlady Dorothea Puente.
I think Dorothea had managed to convince herself that she could still get away with this. I think she had been so manipulative and such a liar throughout her entire life that just because the police were on the scene, I don't think Dorothea even panicked. She's been managing to commit these murders for a very long time without getting caught. So that's already reinforcing the idea that she can do whatever she wants and not have to suffer consequences for her actions.
Detective Cabrera halted the dig. A full forensic search of the whole yard would have to begin the next day, when he would be joined by an excavation team.
Dorothea was in the house all the time. The only time she came out is when I had found the human remains. And she came down, and I remember asking her, "Do you know what this is?" And she looked down into the hole, and she could see the bone. And she grabs your mouth, and she's, "Oh, is that what I think it is?" And yeah. "What can you tell me about this?" She says, "I don't know. But there's been other people that's been living here." Never said really much after that. But it was that Saturday that things got a little different the following day. When I was digging here, I looked up at one point onto that balcony, and Dorothea was standing there looking right straight down at me. I can still see her there, holding onto the rails, just staring at me. And it was here that she stopped me and wanted to ask me a question. And she says, "Am I under arrest?" And I said, "Why do you ask?" And she said, "Well, all of this is making me nervous." And she goes, "I would like to get a cup of coffee. And I'd like to go over to where my nephew is, around the corner at the hotel." I said, "Get what you need and then I'll walk you over there." Thinking, I want to see where she's going, if that's what's happening. So she comes walking out, has a little red coat, has her purse. What I had told her was that I would escort her because there were a lot of people starting to gather, and I thought, I don't want anyone walking up to her bothering her, so I used that ruse to walk her down to the corner.
Her appearance, her demeanor, her whole kind of personality was really her greatest weapon because it didn't arouse any suspicion whatsoever at that point.
Had the person of interest or suspect at the time been a young male, I don't think for 1 second that they would have let him out of their sight. Absolutely not.
So I run back and I continue digging again. Short time later, I hit something. And I keep trying to bring it up, and I do. And in my shovel is a human leg. So immediately I stop, I yell to my commander, "We have another one." And he runs over, and the first thing he asks is, "Where's Dorothea?"
Puente wasn't at the hotel having coffee. In fact, she was nowhere to be seen.
This was an opportunity for her to take flight. She knew I was just about to hit the second body. She had to find a window of escape. And this brief moment that she got me to stop digging and then be able to go get some coffee, she used it as her window of escape, and she fled.
So now Dorothea is on the run. This is extremely dangerous for society and for law enforcement because, once again, she is not your prototypical serial killer. She's able to disappear into the wind, and nobody's going to think this is somebody that we should be on the lookout for. This is somebody who seems extremely dangerous. So she's already one step ahead of law enforcement, not only because she's managed to escape, but simply because of her physical appearance and her demeanor.
At that time, we put out an all-points bulletin. I went to seek an arrest warrant through the district attorney's office. But during that whole time, all this was going on, the digging continued. And as we kept digging, we kept finding bodies and more bodies. And it just seemed endless. Whatever we took down, whatever we moved, wherever we were digging, we'd find a body. It was just unbelievable.
In the yard of 1426 F Street, Deputy Coroner Laura Santos was in charge of the excavation.
Things were kind of unfolding rapidly. The preceding day, the anthropologist had noticed several things in the yard that looked unusual, and so we had an idea of where we might start on Sunday. So we both started kind of just very carefully digging around.
It was at this point that Coroner Laura Santos and Detective John Cabrera were to solve the missing persons case that had prompted the search in the first place, as they came across the remains of Bert Montoya.
Bert would be the third body that I found. He was buried under a concrete basin in the backyard, and he was down about 4 feet.
He was bundled up in multiple layers of plastic, blankets, and they were all sewn loosely and duct taped.
It was obvious that the state of decomposition gave me the idea that, yes, this would be something where someone missing for 3 months might be. And so he was number 3. And that puzzle was now solved.
The unearthing of 3 more bodies quickly followed, but there was one final discovery to make, even more gruesome than the rest.
Right here would be the final grave in which we would dig. We dug down 5 feet, and there's where we would find Betty Palmer. That was the last person that we would find in this yard. And turned out that she would be our victim that was dismembered.
Well, she was kind of bundled up in almost like a scrunched up seated position, but she was missing her head, hands, and feet. And she was trussed up with rope around it, I remember. And the grave, instead of being more shallow and linear, was kind of a big pit.
By Monday, the 14th of November, 7 bodies had been uncovered in the garden of 1426 F Street. 3 days later, Dorothea Puente was apprehended by police.
She fled on the 12th, and on the 16th, I just happened to be watching TV about 10 o'clock at night, and they had a special report popped up, and I see her being escorted by 2 LAPD officers. And I was just like, wow, she's in custody. I call my supervisor immediately and I says, are you watching what I'm watching? Yeah, I said, we've got to get down to Los Angeles.
On the run from police, Puente had made her way from Sacramento to Los Angeles. She started up a conversation with a man in a bar, and that was to prove her undoing.
He goes home, and while he's watching TV, he sees her on TV as being wanted on the news. So he calls LAPD, gives the information. I was just having drinks with this person. And here's her address. They took the information, they went over to the hotel, knocked on the door, she answered. They asked for her name, she gave a different name. And then the officer says, may I see some ID? And at that time, she just simply tells them, I'm the person you're looking for. My name is Dorothea Puente.
After escorting Puente back to Sacramento, Detective Cabrera and coroner Laura Santos set about identifying the remaining unknown bodies that had been excavated. It was to take a further 4 months.
In the beginning, there were people saying, oh, you're never going to be able to do this. So I was pretty happy that I was able to identify everybody. Most of them had some family members somewhere, and so they were all buried.
All in all, in the very end of the investigation, she would be charged with 9 murders. 7 in the yard in which we would uncover. And then they added Ruth Monroe, who was a business partner in which lived here. The 9th victim is Everson Gilmuth, and he would be added to the case. Everson Gilmuth was from Oregon, and it all started when they were pen pals. When she was in prison, he was writing her. And then when she paroled in 1985, he went and picked her up and drove her back here to the boarding house. And this is where he would be staying. But in actuality, he was laying in a homemade coffin along the Sacramento River in early 1986. He would be found by a group of fishermen who were out doing some early morning fishing. They looked in the box and they saw these remains. And Everson would remain a John Doe until this case in 1988 broke. And that's when his family contacted our office and saying, we're looking for a father.
The investigation into these 9 murders would also reveal a likely cause of death.
We did find traces of Delmane, the drug, in the bodies.
This particular drug, when coupled with alcohol, could be deadly. It just simply puts you in a catatonic state, and with the alcohol, overwhelm the body and stop the heart.
None of the victims had ever been prescribed Delmane. Only Dorothea Puente had been prescribed Delmane.
Drugging victims is something which we often see with female offenders in particular. It allows them to physically subdue a victim, which they wouldn't necessarily ordinarily be able to physically if a victim was at full capacity. So it's not unusual that this would be a method of choice, particularly for someone like Puente, who was described as being quite slight and quite frail in her appearance.
Where we are right now inside the house is where Dorothea would bring her victims after giving them the drug and alcohol combination. At that time, there was a carpet, and when I came in here, it seemed nice. It had a day bed. There were gifts on there, just like a normal room, until I pulled back that carpet. And when I pulled the carpet back, the odor was so overwhelming, it was unbelievable. But I knew and recognized that smell. And it was the smell of putrefied body fluid that had seeped through the wooden floor from her victims who had laid there for anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, probably.
"20 years later, journalist Martin Coos was still looking for answers from Dorothea Puente, but his time was running out.
Toward the end of that first conversation, I felt I had nothing to lose about asking her for the opportunity to visit again. And by then, there was enough of a rapport between the two of us that I felt that there was likely a good chance that she would agree to it, and she did.
Coos visited Puente a total of 6 times over a span of several months.
When I would ask her whether she had committed these crimes, she wouldn't answer the questions outright. What she would in effect do was to answer a question with another question. Why would I do that? Why would I take these people in and care for them and feed them and clothe them?
Puente trying to control the conversation, I think, is very interesting and indicative of that idea that she's trying to maintain control over her own narrative. Protecting herself and her self-image was the ultimate end goal for her. And by doing so, she was able to turn herself into the victim, even just in her own eyes.
During her interviews with Coos, Puente did her best to avoid discussing the victims of her crimes.
Never once on her own did she mention the tenants who had died. She had never expressed any kind of remorse for them.
Dorothea's look was one of her best weapons, but she had interpersonal weapons that also were an advantage to her. For example, the pathological lying that came as a second nature to her, combined with the lack of remorse and the lack of empathy and the ability to manipulate. When you put all of those factors together, along with her physical appearance, you have probably the most unassuming serial killer in history.
Dorothea Puente had been on remand for 4 years following her arrest. On the 9th of February 1993, she finally faced trial in Monterey County. Detective Cabrera was called to give evidence.
What I wanted to do was get in there, give my information, give my testimony, and for the sake of the families of these victims, wanted to make sure that she would never walk on the public streets again. During the time that I testified, all she did was look forward. She never looked at the jury. She never looked at me.
I don't believe Puente was capable of feeling shame or remorse for her actions. I think she probably had regret about getting caught, but I don't believe she was capable of remorse or empathy because this was lifelong behavior.
She never confessed to killing anybody. She says they died in her care, and being on parole, she couldn't contact the authorities. So she took it upon herself to give these individuals that she claims had no family, nobody cared. She took it upon herself to give them a proper burial, and she buried them in the yard.
On the 26th of August 1993, after deliberating for 24 days, the jury found Dorothea Puente guilty of 3 of the 9 murders she was accused of. The 6 remaining murders resulted in a hung jury.
I think what disappointed me as an investigator, there was no doubt that the 7 bodies that we found in this yard should have all been guilty charges. However, only 3 of the 7 in the yard would be charged against her. 4 others would go 11-1, with 1 juror saying, no, he didn't believe that's what happened.
We can only speculate because no reason was given, but presumably this is because they saw how she presented during the trial. They saw her physical demeanor, the fact that she was this older lady, someone who couldn't possibly have committed all of these murders.
And so the 3 would do, and that would give us enough for a capital case, which brings in the death penalty. So 6 would go by the wayside.
Puente was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole, plus 15 years to life for the 3rd charge. She was spared the death penalty. Journalist Martin Kuz's final visit with Puente would be in April of 2009.
When I asked her if the death penalty might have been better than a life sentence, she essentially said that it was the same thing. She said, I'm going to die here one way or another. She said, I don't want to be a burden on anyone. And even there's this element of self-pity. In many respects, she was very capable of diabolical behavior, but there was no way that she could square that with her own self-image. This was not someone who felt that she had done anything untoward to anybody. She was the aggrieved party. She was the one who had been victimized. She handed me a form for this prison-approved vendor in which she had written out the items that she wanted, totaling $115. What I understood then was that I was just another mark for the con artist. She was trying to use me, and I understood that when she presented that form to me.
Dorothea views other humans as means to an end. Anybody who comes across her path, unless they are serving a purpose for her, they really have no place in her life.
I walked out of the prison with the form that she had given me for the list of items that she hoped I would order. And I wrote back to her and said there was no way that I could do that. And that was the end of our correspondence. I think she realized at that point that I was useless to her, that she was not going to get from me what she had hoped to. She manipulated people. And that was her way of navigating the system. It's why she was able to have this sort of life of crime for decades. It's because she marked people.
Dorothea Puente was the type of person that was incapable or absolutely unwilling to take accountability for her crimes. So even stared in the face with 5, 6, 7 bodies in her yard, law enforcement, a trial, news media, people calling her a serial killer, even with all of that happening, Dorothea Puente is still unable or unwilling to look at the gravity of what she has done in her life.
In our final conversation, I asked her, how does it feel to be known as a murderer? And she looked me square in the eye and said, I don't give a what anyone else thinks. And that to me was as telling as any comment that she had made to me in the time that we had been talking.
Martin Cous's article for Sacktown magazine was published in 2009. 2 years later, Dorothea Puente died of natural causes in the Central California Women's Prison in Chowchilla. She was 82 years old.
Still curious? Join the Curious Collective for just £1.99 a month. No tiers, no locked content, just full access. You'll get exclusive documentaries, ad-free members-only videos, early access, custom badges, emojis, and member discounts. Hit join below and become part of the investigation. Before you go, I want to give a special thank you to the members of the Curious Collective. Your support helps keep Dead Curious growing and allows me to bring more documentaries, more investigations, and more mysteries. Thank you for being part of the collective.